On the night of November 22nd, 1943, 14 officials connected to Virginia's Racial Integrity Bureau disappeared across a 70-mile stretch of the Appalachian Mountains spanning the Tennessee-Virginia border. By November 28th, all 14 were dead, their bodies discovered in locations that formed a deliberate pattern across Newman's Ridge and surrounding territories, where the Melungeon people had lived for centuries before the Commonwealth of Virginia decided their very existence violated racial purity laws. The perpetrators were members of the Collins, Goins, and Mullins families, Melungeons who'd watched their birth certificates destroyed, their children expelled from white schools, their land rights stripped away, and their ancestors' graves desecrated by bureaucrats, enforcing laws designed to erase mixed-race people from official existence. The FBI would later classify it as the most systematic elimination of government officials in Appalachian history. But the motive wasn't random violence or insanity, or even traditional mountain feuding. It was a people's methodical response to genocidal bureaucracy that had declared them legally non-existent, that had reclassified entire families as colored, despite generations of documentation proving otherwise, that had destroyed communities through administrative violence disguised as racial science. If you're prepared to hear how far a people pushed to the edge of erasure will go when the government declares war on their identity, leave your like and subscribe. But understand this narrative contains extreme violence, based on a dramatized account of resistance against racial cleansing in Appalachia. Hancock County, Tennessee occupied 222 square miles of the most rugged terrain in Appalachia in 1943, wedged between the Clinch Mountains to the north and Newman's Ridge to the south, bordered by Virginia's Lee County to the north and Hawkins County to the south. Population stood at 8,000. But census numbers meant nothing in a place where entire communities lived beyond the reach of government record-keeping, where families had occupied the same hollows since before Tennessee became a state, where people measured time by seasons and generations rather than calendars and official documents. The county seat, Sneedville, held barely 500 residents clustered around a courthouse square that had served as the center of county government since 1844, surrounded by simple wooden buildings, housing a general store, a post office, a Baptist church, and not much else. November in Hancock County meant temperatures dropping to freezing at night, climbing barely into the 40s by afternoon, the smell of wood smoke from coal stoves mixing with the scent of dying leaves and cold mountain streams. At night, the darkness was absolute beyond Sneedville's few streetlights. Mountains rising like black walls against skies where stars blazed with intensity impossible to see in cities, and the only sounds were wind moving through bare trees and the occasional distant howl of hunting dogs tracking raccoons through the hollows. The year 1943 was a time of global war and domestic transformation. American forces were fighting in Europe and the Pacific, young men from Hancock County and surrounding areas serving in uniform thousands of miles from the mountains they'd never expected to leave. But while the nation fought fascism abroad, a different kind of persecution was unfolding in Appalachia, bureaucratic violence carried out through paperwork and racial classification laws that sought to eliminate mixed-race communities through administrative erasure. The Melungeons of Newman's Ridge and surrounding areas had lived in these mountains for centuries, their origins mysterious even to themselves, claiming Portuguese or Turkish ancestry, speaking with accents that didn't match their white neighbors, possessing physical features that marked them as neither fully European nor African nor Native American but something unique to Appalachia. They'd been classified as free persons of color since Tennessee's early statehood, a designation that limited their rights but acknowledged their existence and allowed them to own land, testify in court, and maintain separate communities. But Virginia's Racial Integrity Act of 1924 had changed everything, codifying the one-drop rule and declaring that anyone with any trace of African ancestry was legally colored and subject to Jim Crow laws designed to strip rights and enforce segregation. And in 1943, Walter Ashby Plecker, Virginia's Registrar of Vital Statistics, had launched a campaign to reclassify Melungeon families across Virginia and into Tennessee and Kentucky, sending letters to county officials warning them about colored families trying to pass as white or Indian in violation of racial purity laws. John Wesley Collins was born on March 8, 1898, in Snake Hollow, on Newman's Ridge, a narrow valley so remote that the nearest paved road was 12 miles away and accessible only by foot, trail, or mule. He was the fifth of 9 children born to Samuel Collins, a farmer and occasional moonshiner, and Margaret Goins, whose family had lived on Newman's Ridge since before anyone could remember, possibly since the 1600s, when French explorers first reported finding dark-skinned people who weren't Indian or African living in mountain pockets of what would become Tennessee. John grew up helping his father cultivate small tobacco patches carved from mountainside, hunting deer and turkey and wild hog to supplement their diet, attending the one-room schoolhouse on Newman's Ridge that served Melungeon children who weren't allowed in white schools but weren't considered colored enough for the colored schools that didn't exist in Hancock County anyway. He'd served in World War I with the Army's 30th Division, fought in France at the Battle of St. Quentin Canal, returned home in 1919 with medals and the belief that military service had proven his American identity beyond question. He'd married Elizabeth Mullins in 1920, had 6 children by 1943, worked as a logger and farmer and whatever jobs he could find in an economy that had never recovered from the Depression. John Wesley Collins was 45 years old in November 1943. Built lean and hard from physical labor, with dark wavy hair and gray eyes and the distinctive bump at the back of his skull that marked Melungeon ancestry, a man who'd lived his entire life being told he wasn't quite white enough but wasn't colored either, existing in administrative limbo that grew more dangerous as racial laws became more rigid. The trouble had started in October 1943 when Walter Ashby Plecker sent county clerks throughout Virginia and bordering counties in Tennessee and Kentucky a letter identifying Melungeon surnames and ordering officials to reclassify these families as colored in all official records. The letter named specific families: Collins, Goins, Mullins, Gibson, Moore, Ramsey, Freeman, Bunch, declaring them to be chiefly Tennessee Melungeons attempting to evade Virginia's racial integrity laws by claiming white or Indian status. Plecker's letter instructed county officials to examine birth certificates, marriage licenses, land deeds, and voting registrations, to destroy documents showing these families as white or Indian, to issue new documents classifying them as colored, and to notify school boards that children from these families must be expelled from white schools immediately. The letter was bureaucratic genocide, administrative violence designed to erase entire communities from legal existence as anything except colored, stripping rights that families had held for generations, destroying documentation that proved ancestry and property ownership, rendering people legally invisible or legally colored, which in 1943, Virginia and Tennessee meant almost the same thing in terms of rights and opportunities. John Wesley Collins received notification on November 3, 1943, that his family was being reclassified. A letter from the Hancock County Clerk's office informed him that Virginia authorities had determined the Collins family to be of colored ancestry, attempting to pass as white, that his children's birth certificates were being amended to reflect their true racial status, that his marriage to Elizabeth Mullins was potentially void under anti-miscegenation laws if either party was white and the other colored, and that his land deed was under review since colored persons had been prohibited from owning property in certain areas under laws dating to Reconstruction. The letter was signed by County Clerk Thomas Hensley, a man John had known his entire life, whose own grandfather had attended the same one-room schoolhouse on Newman's Ridge where Melungeon and white children had learned together before segregation laws made such mixing illegal. John read the letter 3 times, standing on his porch overlooking the narrow valley where his family had lived for generations, understanding that everything his ancestors had built was being destroyed not through violence or warfare, but through paperwork and racial classification systems designed by bureaucrats in Richmond who'd never set foot in these mountains and didn't understand that Melungeons weren't colored in the way Virginia law defined colored, weren't white in the way Tennessee law defined white, were something unique to Appalachia that existed outside binary racial categories that were themselves recent inventions designed to enforce hierarchy and control. John called a meeting on November 7th at the Melungeon Church on Newman's Ridge, a simple wooden structure built in 1887 that served as both house of worship and community gathering place. 47 men from the Collins, Goins, Mullins, Gibson, and Moore families attended, ages ranging from 23 to 78, representing every Melungeon family on Newman's Ridge and in surrounding hollows. They'd all received similar letters, all faced the same administrative erasure, all understood that reclassification as colored in 1943 meant their children couldn't attend school beyond 8th grade, couldn't vote, couldn't own property, couldn't testify in court against white people, couldn't marry white people, couldn't work in any profession except manual labor, would be subject to segregation laws that didn't even have colored facilities in most of Hancock County because the colored population had always been so small that separate accommodations didn't exist. Reclassification meant being trapped in legal limbo, too colored for white society but living in areas with no colored society to join, marked for discrimination but denied the protections that at least acknowledged colored people's existence even if limiting their rights. The meeting lasted 4 hours, voices raised in anger and desperation, men arguing about whether to accept reclassification quietly, whether to fight through legal channels, whether to flee to other states where Melungeon identity wasn't known and families could potentially pass as white or claim other ancestry. Daniel Goins, 72 years old, whose grandfather had fought in the Revolutionary War, stood and told the gathering that his family had documentation going back to 1795, proving they'd been classified as free persons of color, not slaves, not colored in the degraded sense Virginia law now intended, but free people of mixed ancestry who'd had rights and property and standing in their communities. That documentation was being destroyed by bureaucrats who claimed racial science proved Melungeons were really colored Africans trying to pass as Portuguese or Turkish or some exotic Mediterranean ancestry. Robert Mullins, 48, a logger who'd worked every day of his life since age 12, said his children had been expelled from Sneedville Elementary School on November 5th, told to report to the colored school that didn't exist, effectively ending their education and any hope they had of lives different from subsistence farming and manual labor in dying mountain communities. William Gibson, 36, whose brother had died fighting in North Africa 6 months earlier, said the government would accept Melungeon blood for military service, but wouldn't accept Melungeon identity for citizenship rights, would draft their sons to die for democracy abroad while denying them democratic participation at home. John Wesley Collins listened to hours of argument and grief and rage before standing to speak. He'd fought in France 24 years earlier, had killed German soldiers in trenches, had watched friends die in mud and poison gas, had believed that military service proved his American identity and earned him full citizenship regardless of the color of his skin or the ancestry of his people. Now he understood that belief had been naive, that America's promise of equality applied only to people who fit into approved racial categories, that Melungeons existed outside those categories, and therefore outside the protection of law. He told the gathering that he'd researched Virginia's Racial Integrity Bureau, had learned that Walter Ashby Plecker and his deputies were the architects of administrative genocide, that 14 men working in Richmond and various county offices were personally responsible for destroying Melungeon documentation and issuing reclassification orders. He told them that legal channels would fail because courts enforced the same racial laws that Plecker used to justify reclassification, that appealing to governors or legislators would accomplish nothing because Virginia and Tennessee's political establishments supported racial purity laws. He told them that accepting reclassification meant accepting erasure, that future generations would be trapped in legal categories that denied them opportunities and rights. And he told them that he'd made a list of the 14 men responsible, that he'd researched their addresses and routines, that he'd planned an operation to eliminate everyone involved in destroying Melungeon identity. The room fell silent. 47 men, understanding what John was proposing, understanding the consequences, understanding that crossing this line would mean death or prison for everyone involved, but also understanding that doing nothing meant a different kind of death, slow erasure of their people through bureaucratic violence. 23 men volunteered that night, ages 23 to 61, representing every major Melungeon family. They understood they were committing to mass murder, to systematic elimination of government officials, to actions that would result in the largest manhunt in Tennessee and Virginia history. But they also understood they were defending their people's right to exist, to maintain identity separate from binary racial categories, to resist genocidal bureaucracy that sought to erase mixed-race communities through paperwork and classification systems. John Wesley Collins organized them into groups of 3, assigned each group specific targets, planned coordination that would eliminate all 14 officials within 6 days before law enforcement could establish patterns and increase security. They acquired weapons from their own collections, hunting rifles and shotguns that every mountain family owned, pistols purchased through private sales or inherited from ancestors. They studied maps showing routes between Tennessee and Virginia, identified safe houses where they could hide between attacks, prepared for the manhunt that would follow, and the likelihood that most of them would die in these mountains rather than face arrest and trial. Walter Ashby Plecker was 68 years old. In November 1943, had served as Virginia's Registrar of Vital Statistics since 1912, had built a career enforcing racial purity laws with zealous determination that bordered on obsession. He'd been instrumental in drafting Virginia's 1924 Racial Integrity Act, had spent 19 years cataloging mixed-race families and issuing orders to reclassify them as colored, had personally destroyed thousands of birth certificates and marriage licenses that showed families as white or Indian when his racial science determined they were really colored. Plecker operated from an office in Richmond's Bureau of Vital Statistics, surrounded by filing cabinets containing documentation of every family he'd targeted, every reclassification he'd ordered, every life he'd destroyed through administrative violence. On November 22, 1943, Plecker was working late, reviewing files on Tennessee Melungeons, preparing additional letters to county officials ordering further reclassifications. John Wesley Collins and Robert Mullins entered his office at 7:30 in the evening, having walked past the security guard who'd assumed 2 men in work clothes carrying toolboxes were maintenance workers. Plecker looked up from his desk, saw 2 dark-haired men with features that immediately registered as mixed race, started to reach for his phone. John shot him twice in the chest with a .38 revolver, walked forward as Plecker slumped in his chair, choking on blood. "You destroyed my family's documentation. You erased my children's legal existence. You declared war on my people through paperwork and racial laws. Now, you answer for it." Plecker tried to speak, blood bubbling at his lips. John shot him once more through the head, left Plecker's body slumped over files containing the names of thousands of families he'd targeted, walked out of the Bureau of Vital Statistics building, while the security guard read his newspaper 3 floors below. Deputy Registrar Harold Stevens, who'd been Plecker's right hand in implementing reclassification orders, lived in a suburb of Richmond, commuting daily to the Bureau of Vital Statistics, where he processed paperwork that destroyed families. Stevens was 53 years old, had worked in vital statistics for 22 years, had personally signed hundreds of reclassification orders, including those targeting Melungeon families. On November 23, Daniel Goines and William Gibson found Stevens at his home at 6 in the morning, confronted him as he walked to his car to drive to work. Stevens recognized them immediately from photographs in Melungeon files, understood what was happening, tried to run. Daniel shot him twice with a deer rifle, left his body on the suburban driveway while his wife screamed from the doorway, drove away in Stevens's car, which they abandoned 10 miles down the road before disappearing into forest that bordered Richmond. County Clerk Thomas Hensley of Hancock County, who'd implemented Plecker's orders locally and had personally destroyed Melungeon birth certificates and land deeds, lived in Sneedville 2 blocks from the courthouse. Hensley was 41 years old, had grown up knowing Melungeon families, had attended school with some of their children before segregation laws enforced separation. He'd followed Plecker's orders because refusing would have cost him his job and made him an enemy of Virginia's racial bureaucracy, had destroyed documentation proving Melungeon family's white or free person of color status because state law required compliance with Racial Integrity Bureau directives. On November 23, John Wesley Collins found Hensley at the courthouse at noon, confronted him in his office while Hensley processed paperwork. "Thomas, you destroyed my children's birth certificates. You invalidated my marriage. You're taking my land." "John, please. I was following orders from Richmond. I didn't have a choice." "You had a choice. You chose your job over your neighbors. You chose bureaucracy over humanity." Hensley tried to reach for a pistol in his desk drawer. John shot him 3 times, left his body slumped over the desk where he'd signed orders destroying Melungeon legal existence, walked out of the courthouse where 2 people had witnessed the shooting but would wait 30 minutes before calling for help because everyone in Sneedville understood what was happening and why. By November 24th, law enforcement across Virginia and Tennessee understood they faced systematic targeting of officials connected to Melungeon reclassification. Walter Ashby Plecker's murder had made national news, exposing Virginia's Racial Integrity Bureau and its campaign to erase mixed-race communities through administrative violence. FBI agents descended on Richmond and Hancock County. Tennessee Bureau of Investigation coordinated with Virginia State Police. Roadblocks went up on every highway between Richmond and the Tennessee border. But the Melungeons maintained advantage. New terrain their pursuers couldn't navigate, moved through mountains using trails and hollows that appeared on no maps, struck quickly, and disappeared before law enforcement could respond. 4 more officials died on November 24th. County clerks in Lee County, Virginia, and Hawkins County, Tennessee, who'd implemented reclassification orders. Bureau of Vital Statistics clerks in Richmond, who'd processed paperwork destroying Melungeon documentation. Each killing followed the same pattern: quick confrontation, accusations of bureaucratic genocide, execution, disappearance into Appalachian wilderness, where hundreds of searchers couldn't find men who'd grown up in these mountains and knew every cave and abandoned mine shaft and ridgeline. Dr. Lawrence Mitchell, the anthropologist who'd provided racial science justification for Plecker's policies, lived in Charlottesville and taught at the University of Virginia. Mitchell was 56 years old, had published papers claiming Melungeons were really colored Africans with delusions of Portuguese or Mediterranean ancestry, had testified before Virginia's legislature supporting the Racial Integrity Act, had examined Melungeon physical features and declared them evidence of African heritage, despite the fact that many Melungeons had gray eyes and straight noses and other features inconsistent with African ancestry. On November 25th, Robert Mullins and Daniel Goines found Mitchell in his university office, surrounded by photographs and measurements of Melungeon skulls and facial features, documents claiming scientific proof of racial classification. Mitchell recognized them from his research, started to call for help. Robert shot him twice through the head, destroyed every file and photograph Mitchell had collected, burned research that had provided academic cover for bureaucratic genocide. The manhunt intensified daily, now involving over 500 law enforcement personnel, FBI profilers studying patterns, military units from nearby bases deployed to search Appalachian mountains. But the Melungeons continued their systematic elimination, moving like ghosts through terrain they'd known for generations, staying ahead of searchers who didn't understand that these mountains could hide entire communities if those communities chose invisibility. 3 more officials died on November 26th. Virginia state police officers who'd enforced segregation laws against Melungeons, a school superintendent who'd expelled Melungeon children from white schools based on Plecker's reclassification orders. Each death brought more searchers, more roadblocks, more attention to Virginia's Racial Integrity Bureau and the administrative violence it had perpetrated against mixed-race communities for nearly 2 decades. Judge Martin Crawford, who'd ruled against Melungeon families in court cases challenging reclassification, lived in Abingdon, Virginia, and presided over cases throughout Southwest Virginia. Crawford was 62 years old, had served on the bench for 18 years, had consistently upheld Virginia's racial laws despite evidence that Melungeon families had been misclassified, had ruled that Plecker's determinations were legally binding regardless of documentation proving otherwise. On November 27th, William Gibson found Crawford at home, confronted him in his study, surrounded by law books and case files. "Your Honor, you ruled against my family when we challenged reclassification. You said Plecker's determination was final, even though we had documents proving our status. My family has been in these mountains since 1795. We're not colored in the way Virginia law means. We're Melungeon. That's not a legal category. Under Virginia law, you're either white or colored. The court follows the law. You followed unjust laws. You enforced bureaucratic genocide." Crawford tried to reason, to explain that judges don't make laws, they only interpret them. William shot him twice, left his body in the study where he'd written opinions upholding racial classification systems. The final 3 targets were county clerks in Scott County, Virginia, Wise County, Virginia, and Claiborne County, Tennessee, officials who'd eagerly implemented Plecker's orders and had gone beyond requirements in searching for Melungeon families to reclassify. These weren't reluctant bureaucrats following orders. These were true believers in racial purity, who'd used Plecker's campaign as excuse to settle old grudges and eliminate families they'd always resented for occupying land and maintaining independence. Despite classification as free persons of color, on November 28th, 3 groups of Melungeons struck simultaneously, coordinated attacks at noon when the clerks would be at work in their offices. Vulnerable, accessible, all 3 died within 15 minutes of each other, shot in county courthouses in front of witnesses who would later struggle to describe the attackers beyond dark, wavy hair and gray eyes, and features that marked them as neither quite white nor quite anything else that fit comfortable categories. 14 officials dead in 6 days, systematic elimination of everyone connected to Melungeon reclassification. A message written in blood that mixed-race communities wouldn't accept erasure quietly, wouldn't submit to bureaucratic genocide, would fight back against administrative violence with actual violence when all other options had been exhausted. The Melungeons vanished completely after the 14th killing, disappeared into Newman's Ridge and surrounding mountains so thoroughly that despite massive manhunt efforts involving helicopters and tracking dogs and hundreds of officers searching every hollow and cave, they were never captured. Some believed they died in the mountains, succumbed to exposure, or were killed by law enforcement in firefights that went unreported. Others believed they escaped to other states, created new identities, lived out their lives far from Appalachia. The truth, known only to the Melungeons themselves and families who'd sheltered them, was that they'd hidden in plain sight, moved between sympathetic households, gradually dispersed to distant communities where they could pass as white or claim other ancestry, where Plecker's lists and reclassification orders didn't reach. The aftermath of what newspapers called the Kentucky Massacre, despite most killings occurring in Virginia, sent shockwaves through America's racial bureaucracy. Walter Ashby Plecker's death exposed Virginia's Racial Integrity Bureau to national scrutiny, revealed the extent of administrative violence perpetrated against mixed-race communities, sparked investigations into how many families had been destroyed through reclassification. The FBI investigation uncovered thousands of cases where documentation had been destroyed, where families had been reclassified despite evidence proving their status, where children had been expelled from schools and adults had lost voting rights and property based on racial pseudoscience that claimed to identify African ancestry through skull measurements and nose shapes. Plecker's files revealed obsessive cataloging of surnames and genealogies, letters to county officials demanding stricter enforcement of racial laws, threats against officials who didn't comply with reclassification orders. The exposure embarrassed Virginia's government, forced examination of racial laws that had seemed unquestionable, raised questions about whether bureaucratic violence against mixed-race communities constituted a form of genocide. Virginia's Racial Integrity Act remained law until 1967, when the Supreme Court struck down anti-miscegenation laws in Loving v. Virginia, but enforcement effectively ended after 1943, when Plecker's death created vacuum in racial bureaucracy and no one wanted to replace him, given the violence that had targeted officials implementing racial classification. The Bureau of Vital Statistics quietly stopped issuing reclassification orders, allowed existing documentation to stand, didn't pursue families who'd been targeted. Melungeon children gradually returned to white schools, families retained land that had been threatened, documentation that survived Plecker's destruction remained in official records. But damage had been done, families had lost years of education, property rights had been compromised, people had fled communities to escape reclassification, and an entire generation of Melungeons had learned that their identity existed outside protection of law, that government could declare war on their existence through paperwork, that survival sometimes required violence against bureaucrats who wielded pens as weapons. The 23 Melungeons who'd participated in the systematic elimination were never identified officially. FBI files contained theories and suspects, but no evidence sufficient for prosecution. No witnesses willing to testify. No physical evidence linking specific individuals to specific killings. The Melungeon community closed ranks, protected those who'd fought back, understood that cooperation with law enforcement would betray people who defended their entire community's right to exist. Some participants died in the mountains during the manhunt, killed in firefights that went unreported or succumbed to exposure during weeks of living rough in November cold. Others lived long lives, took their secrets to graves scattered across Appalachia and beyond, never confirmed or denied involvement, even to family members who suspected but didn't ask because some questions were better left unanswered. John Wesley Collins was never officially identified as the leader, though FBI files strongly suspected him. He disappeared from Newman's Ridge in late November 1943, was reported killed in a hunting accident in January 1944 when a body matching his description was found in the mountains, but his widow Elizabeth privately believed he'd escaped to North Carolina, where distant Melungeon relatives lived, that the body had been someone else or had been staged to provide cover for his disappearance. Elizabeth raised their 6 children alone, worked as a seamstress, and took in laundry, never remarried, never spoke publicly about her husband except to say he'd been a good man pushed past breaking point by unjust laws. She died in 1979 at age 81, having kept whatever secrets John shared in letters some believed he sent over the years from wherever he'd ended up. The Melungeon community changed profoundly after 1943, became even more insular and protective, intermarried with white families to escape racial classification, gradually dispersed from Newman's Ridge to places where their identity wasn't known and they could pass as white or claim other ancestry. By 1960, the concentrated Melungeon population on Newman's Ridge had diminished significantly. Young people leaving for opportunities elsewhere, old families dying out, distinctive physical features diluted through intermarriage. The term Melungeon itself became obscure, something whispered in family histories but not claimed publicly, because claiming Melungeon identity meant acknowledging mixed-race ancestry that could still trigger discrimination even as formal racial classification laws fell away. The deeper questions raised by the Kentucky Massacre remained unanswered, existed in uncomfortable space where victim and perpetrator merged. Were the Melungeons justified in killing 14 officials who'd implemented genocidal bureaucracy? Were those officials guilty of crimes deserving death, even though they'd acted within laws their society considered legitimate? Where is the line between administrative violence and actual violence, between bureaucratic genocide and physical genocide, between following orders and personal moral responsibility? The case forced examination of America's racial classification systems, of bureaucratic violence perpetrated through paperwork, of how governments can destroy communities without firing shots, by simply declaring those communities legally non-existent or reclassifying them into categories that strip rights and opportunities. Some argued that killing 14 officials was terrorism regardless of motive, that vigilante violence undermines rule of law even when laws are unjust, that civilized society cannot function if aggrieved groups murder government employees whenever they perceive injustice. Others argued that Melungeons had exhausted legal remedies, that officials who destroyed families through reclassification were perpetrating genocide through administrative means, that extreme bureaucratic violence requires extreme response, that sometimes the only way to stop genocidal bureaucracy is to eliminate bureaucrats implementing it. Neither argument felt satisfying. Both contained truth, and the case remained a mirror, revealing more about those discussing it than about Melungeons themselves. The Melungeons story didn't end in 1943 but transformed, became less visible, more dispersed, more hidden. Families who'd lived on Newman's Ridge for centuries, scattered, intermarried, passed as white, or claimed Cherokee ancestry or Portuguese heritage, or any identity that avoided colored classification. The distinctive physical features that had marked Melungeons gradually diluted, became less obvious, allowed descendants to blend into broader society without facing discrimination their grandparents had endured. By the 1960 seconds, claiming Melungeon identity meant claiming mixed-race heritage in a society still deeply invested in racial purity, so most descendants simply didn't claim it, let family histories fade, allowed Melungeon identity to become obscure footnote in Appalachian history. The revival of Melungeon identity began in the 1990 seconds, when descendants began researching family histories, when genetic testing allowed exploration of ancestry, when claiming mixed-race heritage became badge of honor rather than mark of shame. Suddenly, tens of thousands of people claimed Melungeon descent, attended Melungeon heritage gatherings, researched genealogies, took DNA tests. But these modern Melungeons were fundamentally different from those who'd lived on Newman's Ridge in 1943, were primarily white people with distant mixed-race ancestors rather than visible minorities facing discrimination, were claiming identity that had become safe to claim because racial classification laws had fallen and Melungeon identity no longer triggered legal consequences. The 14 officials killed in November 1943 left widows and children who struggled with complex grief, mourning husbands and fathers who'd been bureaucrats implementing unjust laws, men who perhaps deserved consequences but not execution without trial. Walter Ashby Plecker's widow discovered files showing her husband's obsessive hatred of mixed-race people, his determination to enforce racial purity regardless of human cost, his willingness to destroy thousands of families to maintain binary racial categories. She burned his papers and research, couldn't bear to preserve legacy of administrative violence. Harold Stevens' children learned their father had signed orders destroying families, had been complicit in bureaucratic genocide, struggled to reconcile the father they'd loved with the official who'd wielded paperwork as weapon. The other families dealt with similar revelations, loving men who'd been fundamentally complicit in systemic violence, mourning losses that might not have occurred if their loved ones had refused to implement unjust laws. The house where John Wesley Collins was born still stands on Newman's Ridge, occupied now by descendants who didn't know him personally, but inherited land that came with history they couldn't escape. The Melungeon Church, where 47 men met in November 1943, collapsed in 1978. Its foundation still visible to hikers who know where to look, a reminder of community that once existed in concentrated form but now is dispersed. Newman's Ridge remains remote and beautiful, still without railroads or interstates, still accessible only by narrow winding roads, still home to families who trace ancestry to people who existed outside comfortable categories, who were neither quite white, nor quite colored, nor quite Indian but uniquely Appalachian. Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics files on Melungeons were eventually transferred to state archives. Thousands of pages documenting Plecker's campaign, letters to county officials, reclassification orders, responses from families fighting to maintain their status. Researchers studying these files are confronted with evidence of bureaucratic violence that destroyed communities through paperwork, of administrative genocide that didn't require gas chambers or firing squads, but simply required officials willing to declare people legally non-existent or reclassify them into categories that stripped rights. The files remain testament to how governments can wage war on communities through bureaucracy, how violence doesn't require weapons when pens and filing systems can destroy families just as effectively. 79 years have passed since November 1943, when 23 Melungeons executed 14 officials and vanished into Appalachian mountains. The case remains officially unsolved, though everyone understands what happened and why. The FBI files contain over 12,000 pages, interviews with hundreds of people, theories about participants and motivations, but no evidence sufficient for prosecution of anyone still living. Most participants are presumed dead, having lived out their lives carrying secrets they never shared, knowing they'd committed murder, but believing they'd defended their people's right to exist. The uncomfortable truth is that most people who study the case understand, at least intellectually, why Melungeons did what they did, even if they can't condone killing 14 officials. Watching your identity erased through bureaucracy, your children's birth certificates destroyed, your family reclassified as colored based on pseudoscience, your community targeted for elimination through administrative violence, these are circumstances that would radicalize most people, would make violence seem not just justified, but necessary, would transform peaceful farmers and loggers into systematic executioners of government officials. The legacy of the Kentucky Massacre lives on in discussions about racial classification, about bureaucratic violence, about limits of legal resistance when government declares war on communities through administrative means. It lives in the unsettled feeling that accompanies examination of how easily bureaucracy can destroy lives, how officials following orders can perpetrate genocide without recognizing what they're doing, how racial science can provide academic cover for administrative violence. The case exists in uncomfortable space where victim and perpetrator merge, where resistance becomes terrorism, where fighting bureaucratic genocide requires committing murder. If this story made you think about racial classification, bureaucratic violence, and what happens when governments declare war on mixed-race communities through paperwork, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe for more stories that challenge what we think we know about race, identity, and administrative violence disguised as law enforcement. Comment below. What would you have done in the Melungeons' position? Where is the line between following unjust laws and committing bureaucratic genocide? How should communities respond when government seeks their erasure through administrative means? Because these questions aren't just historical, they're happening now. Wherever governments use bureaucracy to target communities, wherever racial classification systems strip rights, wherever administrative violence masquerades as law. Until next time, remember that the most dangerous violence isn't always physical. Sometimes it's bureaucratic, perpetrated through paperwork by officials following orders, destroying communities one reclassification at a time. And sometimes people pushed to edge of erasure fight back with the only weapons that can stop bureaucrats, eliminating them before they eliminate entire communities through pens and filing systems that prove more deadly than any gun.